turning to the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews. We'll be in chapter 3. Hebrews chapter 3. That's going to be where we are in our study here. This evening. Hebrews chapter 3. Before we get into chapter 3, I want to quickly remind ourselves of the outline of the book that we are following for the book of Hebrews. And then I go through our chapter content, which again is pretty quick right now because we've only got 2 chapters. But the book of Hebrews is about the fact that Christ is better. Going back into chapter 1 and in verse 4, it talks about how he has, that's our key verse to the book, as well as chapter 1, having become so much better than the angels, which is really what chapter 1 and 2 is about, is dealing with him being better, or most of chapter 1 and then chapter 2 is about him being better than the angels. But that's the key verse, not only setting up chapter 1, but that key verse again to the whole book, because it introduces the idea of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with some Hebrew brethren or Hebrew Christians that it seems are on the verge of giving up. And so as he's writing to, the Hebrew writer's writing to them here, he's reminding them, don't give up. What you have is better than what you're trying to go back to. And that's really what the first 9.5 chapters are about, from chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 10 and verse 18. Verse 19 marks a transition to the second half of the book, or as we sometimes call it, again, the Hebrew writer, whoever he is, again, I think it's perhaps Paul based on evidence, but even if it's not, it's outlined like a lot of Paul's books where you've got really 2 sections. The more argumentative, if you will, and then here's the application of that. That begins at 10 and in verse 19. But in the first 9.5 chapters, he points out to him Christ is superior. He's superior to the prophets in 1:1-3. Superior to angels in chapter 1, verse 4 through the end of chapter 2. Here in chapter 3, he's superior to Moses. Chapter 4, 1-13, he offers a superior rest. The rest of chapter 4, on in through chapter 7, a superior priesthood. Chapter 8, a superior covenant. The first part of chapter 9, a superior sanctuary. And finally, he's a superior sacrifice. So it either says Christ is or he brought something superior to that of the Old Testament. In fact, when we get into chapter 9, the theme of chapter 9 is the old is a type of the new, or a foreshadowing of things of the new. And the point is, the old foreshadowed things of the new that were going to be better or superior to that of the old. Well then, because Christ is better or superior, you don't need to give up, because there is no other way. 10:19 through 13:28. So you need to keep the faith. That's the rest of chapter 10. Look to examples of faith, chapter 11. Endure in faith, chapter 12. And make application of faith, chapter 13. Now our chapter content. Again, it's pretty easy to go through right now. We've only dealt with 2 chapters so far. But chapter 1, he's superior to prophets and angels, that is, Christ is. Chapter 2, he's superior to angels. And in chapter 2, it's argued from a different standpoint. He's superior to angels because he is divine human. And that's what we saw as we were there in chapter 2. He's superior in that he's a divine human. And so really chapter 1 dealt with the fact that he's divine. In chapter 2, he took on flesh or humanity and came to this earth. Well, beginning now at chapter 3, we have really 2 points to chapter 3. Christ is superior to Moses, and do not be disobedient. He's going to connect the 2 here together. Now, beginning at verse 1, he says, "Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Christ Jesus." And so we're transitioning here, but therefore connects us back. We're still arguing Christ is better. The key verse is verse number 3. "For this one has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who built the house has more honor than the house." And so we're comparing Christ and Moses, and this one, that is Christ, has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses. So again, let's get back into chapter 3. Chapter 3 divides down into two sections. The first of those is that Christ is better than Moses, and then the second is do not follow the disobedient example of Israel. But let's begin in verse 1. Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was faithful in all his house. So what we're doing here, what we have taking place here, is we're beginning now not to compare Christ to just the prophets in general. Again, we go back to chapter 1 and 1 to 3. God at various times and in various ways spoke in times past by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken us by his Son. But he compared him to the prophets more in a generalization. Here's sort of the prophets grouped together. He's better than the prophets. That's how God speaks now. Then we deal with the angels. And so, again, they had some part in revealing of the old law as mentioned in chapter 2, but you deal with angels in most of chapter 1 and chapter 2. But then in chapter 3, again, the key is, remember this, we have Hebrew Christians who are trying to go back to what? The law of Moses. So the old law, or what we often call the law of Moses, here is an important historical figure in the history of the Jews. Here's an important biblical figure in Moses. Somebody that, again, we call it the law of Moses. He's the one that goes up on Mount Sinai, and God gives that law too. So what we're doing now, what the Hebrew writer's doing now, is he's comparing Christ to Moses. He's bringing in one of the most significant figures in the minds of a Jew. And he's drawing this comparison. Perhaps the only person he could compare him to that they might care more about is who? Perhaps Abraham, as they boasted themselves on being the children of Abraham. Perhaps that's the only character that in Jewish minds would have been more held in more esteem than Moses would have been Abraham. Again, some of the others they had respect for, but when you think about it, the law of Moses and everything and how they talked about it, perhaps he's second in terms of significant figures to the Jews, only to Abraham. And so he's coming back and he's turning to Moses to compare the two. And what he does is he begins by saying, therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling. The call of the salvation that they had is from where? It's from heaven. And it pertains in going to heaven. In terms of, one writer put it this way. Dan King, in his commentary on the book of Hebrews, put it this way: the older religion was an earthly calling with an earthly inheritance. Christianity is a spiritual religion involving a heavenly calling with a spiritual and heavenly inheritance as its ultimate object. I think that's a good comparison there. The ultimate end result for the Jews was they wanted to go to be in the promised land. In fact, when we get to chapter 4, you know what chapter 4 is really pointing out? They went in and had that rest that was promised, but there remains therefore rest for the people of God. We have a superior rest. And so you go back to that the older religion, if you will. Go back to the law of Moses. That was more earthly in nature. Now we're dealing with the spiritual religion that ends. The result is talking about going to heaven. And he's drawing a comparison here between the two. You're partakers of the...
I think something that adds credibility, what he says, if they was going to go to somebody, who would they go to? And then John the Baptist, earthly ministry, he started out, he said, don't say to yourself, we have Abraham as your father. He said God could raise descendants out of these rocks, that would be descendants of Abraham. So, yeah, I think like you said, not just Jesus, but even John the Baptist, he would refer back to Abraham because they held him in such high regard. But what he was doing there was saying, hey, this Jewish privilege you think you have, don't put too much stock in or whatever like that.
You're right, and even here he's comparing back, again, I think King makes a good point in his commentary that the statement that may go missed on is partakers of the heavenly calling. We think, yeah, that's a phrase we're familiar with, but there's a contrast that you're drawing here between the new and the old and the result of the new and the old. And that old is what they sort of hung their hat on. You go back to Romans, and what Paul is dealing with in the book of Romans is Jews trying to go back to the old law and boast in the things of the old law. And the whole point of chapter 4 is you're not saved by deeds of the old law. Continuing now, he calls him, when we talk about Christ here and how he's better than Moses, there's three things he talks about. Christ is the faithful apostle and high priest, 1 to 2. He's the builder of the house, 3 to 4. But not only is he the builder, he's the son over his house, 5 to 6. So we begin with an apostle. So again, the readers, he talks about him being apostle or high priest. The word apostle is one sent forth. So Jesus is called to be an apostle in that he's sent by God. And so he's doing the will of the Father. He's our high priest, is brought up in several chapters. It's brought up at the end of the previous chapter. It's going to be dealt with more at the end of chapter 4 and so on. He's the one who goes in to make a sacrifice. And he is the sacrifice as well, but he's our high priest. Now, in a sense, Moses, though he's never called an apostle, there's a sense in which Moses is an apostle in this point. Again, the word apostle has to do with one being sent forth. Moses is somebody who, you go back to the Old Testament, didn't go lead Israel out because he just decided it was a good idea. He was sent forth by God. And so as we talk about this idea of sent forth, there's really a contrast. Here's Moses, who, look at verse 2, is faithful in all his house. Right? And you go back and you look at Moses and the kind of man he was, and Moses made mistakes. We know that's why he didn't enter the promised land. But Moses dealt with those mistakes. He repented of that. He dealt with them when they came. But here's a man that you would say is a faithful individual. In fact, we're going to come later on in chapter 11 in what is sometimes called the Hall of Faith. And guess who's listed there? Moses. Here's this faithful individual, faithful in all his house, faithful as a servant of God. But Jesus is the apostle and high priest who's faithful to him who appointed him. Guess what? Christ is faithful. And as he compares him and moves throughout, he's making the point, Christ is faithful. You think Moses is faithful? Christ is faithful the way he was called to. And keep this in mind, when you talk about the house, and here's what Moses is faithful to, getting into verse 2, he was faithful in all his house. Christ built the house, verse 3 and 4. For this one has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who built the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. And so you say, well, Moses was faithful in his house. Well, guess what? According to verse 3, Moses may be faithful to the house, but the one that built the house has more honor and glory than the house. Moses may be faithful in it, but Christ is the builder. For every house is built by someone. You walk through town and you see a house, and guess what? Somebody built it. That didn't just appear there. Somebody built the house. And as he's talking here, the house that is built is God. God has built all things, and here is Christ, who is the builder of the house. He's the builder of God's house. He's superior to Moses because Moses is in God's house. Now, we're talking the New Testament sense about the house being the church, but as we go back to the old law, and the law that was given, Moses was faithful to that, but the builder is who? It's given by God. Moses is faithful to that, but Christ is the builder of all things, and Christ established the New Testament church, the house, as is called in 1 Timothy 3:15. So Moses is faithful, but Christ is the builder. Verse 5 now, Christ is the son over the house. Moses was simply a faithful servant in the house. And Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which would be spoken afterward. So we say Moses was faithful, but he's faithful as what? He's not the builder. He's not the son. He's faithful as a servant. Verse 6, but Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are if we hold fast the confidence of the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. Moses is a faithful servant. His service and his work pointed as a testimony of something better to come. In fact, remember we saw on Sunday morning as we talked about the scheme of redemption. Remember, in Deuteronomy 18, there would be a prophet like unto who? Moses. He's pointing to Christ. Moses was involved in preparation for Christ, telling the prophecies that are given in others like Moses gives. But Christ is the fulfillment. Christ is the one who holds the position of son, a place of authority in the house. The people of God are the house of God. That's what he points out in verse 6. These individuals he's writing to that are Christians, they are part of the house of God. Yes, in the sense that him being the son, he's going to have that authority. I think the point ultimately that he's driving at here is the fact that you're all, is he's still drawing that contrast, not as much about the dealing right now with that idea of authority, but I do think that's going to take part of it. Being the son gives him that authority that's under him, but more the position that they hold within the household is the argument. The son is greater than the servant. In fact, when we were back in Galatians, that was a point that was made in arguing about Isaac being the son of promise versus Ishmael, the son of a servant. There was the son of the free woman and the son of the bondwoman in Galatians that's dealt with. And he holds that position of authority. So you're right, that authority is part of that, him being the position of a son, which is why I go to verse 6. If we hold fast to the confidence and rejoicing of the hope firm to the end, if we hold fast to that confidence, we hold fast to the rejoicing of hope firm to the end, we are the house of God. Now, I'm going to encourage you here. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but I would encourage you here. Something important to note as you move throughout Hebrews is the fact that, again, we're writing and talking to Hebrew what? Christians. And so, we mentioned it the other day when we were on Sunday in chapter 2. We must give them more earnest heed lest we drift away. And he talks about how we have something better. So we talked about how there's this drifting away that can take place. We've got to be in God's Word because we can fall away. Something important to note is you're going to look at terminology. And we're going to get to some here later on. And unless there be any evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But note some phrases here that show us that we're dealing with people that truly are servants of God. Again, sometimes if you're talking to someone and you say, you can fall away with it. Well, if they follow, they're not really the servant they needed to be. And so that's the argument that's going to be used. Well, Simon the sorcerer, look at what he did. Well, he didn't really obey like he should have, and then that's why he fell away. Well, let's look at what's said about the Hebrews here. They are, look at verse 1, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling. You know what that sounds like to me? Sounds like a Christian. We are the house of God if we hold fast to the confidence, the rejoicing, the hope, firm to the end. Not that they need to get in, but they've got to hold fast. Look at verse 14. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. Become partakers with Christ. We're going to see, by the way, especially as we get into chapter 10, and he talks about not giving up later on more. We're going to see that phrase come up more and more again. Because again, right now we're mostly dealing with the idea of Christ is better. And we're going to have some, I mentioned the other day, there's sometimes some warnings that comes with it. Somebody said, again, it's been pointed out by some writers, I think they argue there's a doctrinal section and a warning section. So chapter 1, Christ is better than angels, and here's the evidence. So chapter 2, take heed lest you fall. Back to now, he's better than angels because he's a divine human. In chapter 3, he's better than Moses. And guess what we're going to end on chapter 3? Because of what I've said in 2 and 3, here's a warning. And so there's some warnings throughout. The big warning really comes at the end. Don't give up. There is nowhere else to turn. As you just pointed, Christ is better. Where are you going to go that's better than Christ? So let's get now to that warning. As we talk about Christ is better than Moses, that leads to a warning. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. So the second section now is about do not follow the disobedient example of Israel. He's going to go now to the people of the day of Moses. Christ is better than Moses. Now let's look at a warning that was given to God's people under the old law in the days of who? Back when? Moses. And so don't follow their example. So there's a warning from the example. Then there's a warning to beware lest you depart. And then he talks about why Israel did not enter in. So let's focus on 7 to 11, the warning from the example of Israel. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the day, as in the rebellion, as in the day, the trial of the wilderness, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works 40 years. Therefore I was angry with that generation and said, they also go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways, so I swore my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Let's go ahead here. There's one of your questions. It's question 3. We'll come back in a second to the ones before. But question number 3, let's catch up. Let's go ahead and back up to question. And we'll catch up here. Question 1, what's the chapter about? Briefly summarize the chapter. What are the 2 main sections?
Christ is better.
Christ is better than Moses, and do not be disobedient. Question 2, how is he superior to Moses? What 3 things did we see in the previous section? It's also, if you have your book with you, it's in your outline. Christ is the faithful apostle and high priest. He's the builder of the house, and he's the son over the house. And so that's how Christ is better than Moses. Moses is a faithful servant. Christ is the builder and the son. So let's get to question 3 now. This is one, we said there are 3 questions that are the same. There's 5 questions for every chapter. 3 questions are the same for every chapter. Briefly summarize the chapter, then making application of the chapter. Those are 1 and 5. 3 and 4 throughout here. It's question 3 in this lesson. List the Old Testament passages quoted. There's 2 quotations from the Old Testament. Both of them are from the same chapter. As it comes back to it again. What are the 2 quotations? Verses 7 through 11 and then verse 15 are the 2 quotations, or where they're quoted. Both of those are found in Psalm 95. 7 through 11 of Hebrews 3 is Psalm 95. Let's make it easy to remember. 7 through 11. And then verse 15 re-quotes Psalm 95, 7 and 8 as he's making application of that. Making application of that again and brings it back up. Those are our quotations. Again, the reason we want to go back to these, the reason we want to remind ourselves of these is the Hebrew writer's writing to a group of Hebrew Christians who are familiar with the law of Moses. So when he's proving his point, where does he go to? Go back and look at what the old law says and draw that comparison and contrast. And so he goes back to that. Yeah.
As we talked about the word "if" there a couple of minutes ago, I got this highlighted in my Bible, but in Romans chapter 11, verse 22, it says, "Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fail severity, but toward you goodness." And it says, "If you continue in His goodness, otherwise you will be cut off." So it kind of makes this same point. And we need to know these things, because of the people that say that once you become a Christian, you can't do anything to be lost. But it's just reiterated here in Romans chapter 11 and verse 22. And where it says that what would separate us from the love of God. Well, God won't let go of us, but we can let go of Him. I guess it's love.
You're right. As I said before, and Romans is another one, but Galatians and Hebrews, I think, are 2 of the best books for pointing that out, where he talks about the warnings in Galatians, but Hebrews, because time and time again you have the phrase like you're partakers of the heavenly calling and all this. And then he comes back later on and talks like in chapter 6, verse 6, then they fall away. Here's what you were, but then because of the path you're on, then you're going to fall away if because of these things. He talks about those that were once enlightened. And so I think this book drives that point home, you're right, time and time again. But coming back now to this, and not following the example of Israel, as he talks about Israel, quoting from Psalm 95, relaying back to some of the Old Testament events, particularly when you've got those that come back from the Promised Land. That's part of this rebellion. There's a lot of rebellion that took place in the days of Moses. But they come out of the promise, the 12 spies come back from the Promised Land, and they say the land is just as good as we were told it was going to be. It really is a land flowing of milk and honey, but there's the descendants of Anak, those that were the giants. And so 10 of them said, well, we can't take the land. And then, of course, Joshua and Caleb said they could, and that generation died there in the wilderness. Think about after that, even, the time. You've got those that rebelled against God, and He sent the fiery serpents. That's where Moses had to make the bronze serpent for them to look at. Something, by the way, that later on in the history of Israel became an idol and had to be torn down. I believe it was in the days of Hezekiah. And so you go throughout the complaining for manna, the complaining for water, the The water's too bitter. The water that they had was too bitter, and then they needed water. So Moses struck the rock. Then they needed water again, and Moses is supposed to speak to the rock. That's the time he strikes the rock so that he can't enter in. Again, you got the bronze serpent. You got them not entering in. Time and time again, the people of Israel just complained and complained and rebelled against God. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It's another passage that talks about the example of Israel, which names several instances of them doing it. It also lists there the sin of Baal of Peor. That takes place after the events of Numbers 13 and 14. Remember, we studied the idea of not let me die the death of the righteous from the statement Balaam made in Numbers chapter, I think it's 22 or 23, where Balaam's there. That story of Balaam spans several chapters, and it's after that sin of Baal of Peor. That's after the events of the wilderness. Just time and time again, they rebelled against God. So what he says, what the psalmist says in Psalm 95, and what the Hebrew writer quotes from, is if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the days of trial in the wilderness where your fathers tested me. So you go back, when it came time to enter the promised land, here are the people of Israel ready to enter in the promised land. The people come back and say, the land's wonderful, but there's giants. And their response should be, well, God's been with us all this way. Let's go take the land. But their hearts are hardened, and we can't take the land. They listen to the 10, and they don't enter in. And so, the warning is for us, verse 12, beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. They should have known after everything they'd seen. You remember back, just go back in the time. A lot of times, only a couple of years or so have passed. They spent a good deal of time at Sinai. But you go back to the 10 plagues in the land of Egypt. They leave Egypt. They get to the Red Sea. And then the armies of Egypt are pursuing them. And the Red Sea parts. They walk through on dry ground. And then God has the sea come on the people of Egypt. They go down to Mount Sinai. They're attacked by some of the nations around them. And God delivers them there. And you just go throughout the history of Israel. They should, at this point, have confidence. God is going to be with us. But instead, they departed from the living God because they had hardened hearts and hearts of unbelief. So the warning to us is, do not, or beware, lest any of us have that evil heart of unbelief and we depart from the living God. Here's, again, when you think about everything that God has promised and everything that God has done, these are people that are going to be familiar with the history of Israel. So now, we talked about some of the events before then. After that event, you think about throughout the history of Israel, how they conquer the land, how they conquered it, the city of Jericho, in the most peculiar of military strategies from the human standpoint. You don't capture a walled city by walking around the city once a day for 6 days, 7 times on the 7th day, and then sound the trumpets and shout on the 7th day, and the walls come tumbling down. From a military standpoint, that does not make any sense. But God was with them, and they took the land. You think about David and fighting Goliath. There's no way he should have been able to defeat somebody when estimates are he's about 5'5", and Goliath is somewhere from 9.5 to 12 feet, depending on how you range a cubit. Somebody that's about twice his size, give or take, and he defeats him. You think about all the times throughout the history of Israel where that they had what would seem to be an inferior army, and God had delivered them. Remember the time that they were surrounded by the enemies of the Lord. When Sennacherib in his writings for Assyria says, I have Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. And the Lord sends an angel to destroy the armies of Assyria that night. And all that history of Israel that they're familiar with, and everything that God's done, and how He's trustworthy and you can trust His word, and they want to abandon what He said. Now, beware, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief, lest you depart from the living God, but instead exhort or encourage one another daily. That's something that's not a one-time thing. That needs to be done daily. We need to exhort and encourage one another while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sins. For we've become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end, while it is said, today, if you will hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. He's playing on that word today. That phrase in Psalm 95 begins with, Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Here's a warning to you today, because you may not have a hardened heart today, but if you're not careful, you may have a hardened heart tomorrow. So exhort one another daily while it's called today. Because guess what? That heart may be hardened by tomorrow. So exhort one another while it's called today. And that's why he comes back and he goes back to that quotation from the Old Testament, Psalm 95, 7 and 8. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your heart as in the rebellion. What the Hebrew writer is telling them is, I'm giving you God's word. You understand about it. Really, you understand everything he's done for you. You're partakers of the heavenly calling. You're partakers of Christ. So hold fast. Hold the beginning of our confidence. Hold fast to that confidence and rejoicing of hope. You hold on to that and don't become hardened. Otherwise, look at 16 and 19. You may become like Israel, who did not enter into their promised rest because of unbelief.
Maybe you work with somebody, and every time that they give the job, they do it right. After a while, you think, well, you earn credibility, or maybe I've dealt with you 100 different times. You've told me you do something you fall through doing. You think that you earn credibility with people. But then that 101st time, if you say it, not him, fall around and say, I don't know if you're going to do that or not. That'd be kind of a slap in the face to you. It's kind of like God. He's proved himself over and over and over again. And then they get these conditions, and like you said, the Red Sea, how are we going to escape this? What are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? Then Joshua and Caleb, we sang the song, Standing on the Promise. One of those two was standing on the promise of God. But I guess my point is, if you're somebody that tells the truth, and God certainly tells the truth, it's impossible for him to lie. And then for people to start doubting, whether it's them or us today, that's a slap in the face of God.
Absolutely, and that's, again, we're going to get later on in the book, and one of the points that's going to be made later on when we talk about the superiority of Christ is he talks about the superiority of his covenant, and we have a covenant that's superior because it's built on better promises in chapter 6. There's some exhortations based on God's promises, and we've had there were good promises under the Old Testament, but the new law, the New Testament, is built on superior promises. Let's hit 16 through 19. This will help finish chapter 3, but set up our study as well for, Lord willing, Sunday in chapter 4. For who, having heard, rebelled? So who, having heard, rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter the rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. So again, you go back to 16, or to verse 15. Go back to the previous quote. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the day of rebellion. Well, you might sit there and say, well, who could hear the voice of God and then have a hardened heart and rebel against him? And the point that the Hebrew writer is making is, really, it was our forefathers that did. You go back throughout the history of Israel and go all the way back to when they were standing there on the promised land. They heard, and yet they rebelled. Again, going back to that what we mentioned earlier, when the spies come back, and God says they can take the land, and they're, well, you know what, I don't know that we can take the land. They should have recalled everything that he's done. By the way, in a sense, we talk about hearing his voice. We hear his voice as we're reading from his word. A lot of those standing there had actually heard the voice of God. Recall at Mount Sinai, where God spoke to the people directly, and they were so afraid, they said, you know what, Moses, why don't you go up and you just tell us what he says, because they so feared after that. They had not heard his voice just in the sense that they had heard his word. They had actually heard the voice of God, and they had rebelled. And so the warning really is, we need to be careful that we don't do that too. That's where we're going to set up chapter 4. They didn't enter in to the rest that was promised. That is, that older generation passed away. They did not enter into the promised land, the rest promised by God under the old covenant. Here we come in the new, and under the new law, we have a superior rest, a rest that's still offered for the people of God. So we've got to be careful that we enter that, which chapter 4 will deal more with. I want to focus on 18 and 19 real quick as we end. talk about practical lessons that we can learn. This really will answer question 4 as well as practical lesson. We'll hit on this quickly. Why did the people not enter in? 2 reasons are given. Verse 18, they did not obey. Verse 19, it was because of unbelief. So something important to note. I bring this up sometimes. People may make a statement like Mark 16:16. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be condemned. Well, why does it not say, and if he doesn't believe? And the point is, if you don't believe, you're not going to obey to where there's no concern about having to tell you if you're not baptized. It just says if you don't believe. Belief and obedience at times are used synonymously. Romans chapter 10 here as well. The reason they didn't enter in was because they did not obey, because of unbelief. And so, just an important note, if somebody raises that question to you, that you can point out that belief and obedience are sometimes used in the Scriptures synonymously. Lord willing, we'll pick up then in chapter 4 and talk about the superior rest that is promised on Sunday